We'll hear more from Senator Cruz in just a moment, but first let's get reaction from House Intelligence Chairman Devin Nunes. Chairman, welcome to Fox News Sunday.
Thanks, Shannon.
I want to start by asking you about reports citing international intelligence officials saying that ISIS has trained at least 400 fighters and has deployed them across Europe to carry out more attacks. What is your understanding of the imminent threat to Europe right now?
Well, what I always advise people is these numbers that you're hearing are only the numbers that the intelligence community actually knows about. I think what's more concerning is that the spectrum of threats continues to grow because we know the people that we know about, but we don't know the people that have went to Syria and Iraq and come back. Altogether, that's probably in the thousands, and then they're training locals. So they're going to these refugee populations, training people, bringing people into the fold, going to the mosques, and you look at places like Belgium, France, Germany, Turkey, other parts. Those are areas, I think, with high populations that have to be concerned about more attacks in the future.
With that in mind, I want to play a little bit of the president's weekly address in which he talked about taking on ISIL and thought this is a part of the puzzle. Here's what he said.
As we move forward in this fight, we have to wield another weapon alongside our airstrikes, our military, and our counterterrorism work, and our diplomacy. And that's the power of our example. Our openness to refugees fleeing ISIL's violence.
We know that several of the suspects linked to a number of these terror attacks across Europe were posing as Syrian refugees. Are you confident that the U.S. screening and vetting process is foolproof enough that we can move forward with what the president's suggesting?
No, I'm not, and that's why the House of Representatives last year asked for a pause in the refugee program. And I want to be clear that I do believe that we need to accept refugees from around the globe, especially from places that are war-torn, that have dictatorships. We need to be the beacon of light around the globe. But at this the Congress has spoken very clearly that we need a pause on this program when you look at refugees that are coming from potential ISIS or al-Qaeda infested areas, including Iraq and Syria. However, the Senate will not vote on it. So the Senate Democrats have killed the opportunity to vote on a pause on this refugee program. The longer this refugee program goes unchecked, the longer that we don't take care of ISIS and al-Qaeda, the more that this threat will grow day by day.
We have seen here in the U.S. ISIS sympathizers, some who have carried out attacks, some who have been charged with supporting the organization or hoping to get involved with the organization or support it. With that in mind, then, do you think that there are operable cells or lone wolves who've been trained or inspired by ISIS here in the U.S. today?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to always refer to this to ISIS and al-Qaeda because a lot of people forget that al-Qaeda actually carried out a very similar attack in Europe just last year in Paris. ISIS and al-Qaeda are kind of estranged cousins. They're competing, but at the same time they have the same goal, which is to attack our allies in the West and ourselves. So when you look forward, going forward, it's not just about the people who went to Iraq and Syria and come back. It's not just about the people we don't know about. It's also the capability that ISIS and al-Qaeda are using over the internet in encrypted chat rooms that we cannot get into that are radicalizing people here in the United States, what we call self-radicalization.
After the attacks in Brussels this week earlier, you said, from my vantage point, it does look like an attack on Americans. It looks like it was targeted toward Americans to some degree. We know there are 4 Americans among the dead from a number of different countries. Is that still your opinion, that Americans were the target?
Well, I think we start out with the fact that we know that Americans and our allies in the West are always a target. What I was talking about, referring to is that as the facts come together, as the Belgian police and investigators begin to put this together, if it does in fact end up that the American airlines were targeted and perhaps a metro station close to the U.S. Embassy was targeted, if that ends up being a fact, then yeah, I think that you have to say that Americans were at least part of the target, just like when they attacked the attack in Paris, which appeared to be targeted towards an American rock band. And so, furthermore on this point, what I think people forget also is that when you have people who were born in Europe, who hold Western passports, that travel over to Iraq and Syria and get trained by either ISIS or al-Qaeda types, or get radicalized in Europe by ISIS or al-Qaeda types, they hold Western passports, so they can then transit into the United States. And that's what we remain concerned about. It's why the FBI director has said that there are investigations going on in 50 states.
President Obama this week took some criticism for continuing with trips that were long planned, attending a baseball game with Raul Castro in Cuba, tangoing in Argentina. But he stuck with what seems to be a philosophy of his, and it's not just him. I mean, there are lawmakers on both sides of the aisle that have suggested if you stop your routines, if you part with your life and your schedules, that essentially terrorists end up winning. Here's a bit of what he had to say along those lines in Argentina.
It is very important for us to not respond with fear. We defeat them in part by saying, you are not strong, you are weak.
True.
So what needs to happen here is that the Obama administration submitted their strategy to the United States Congress, which was a 7-page strategy on defeating what they call extremism. First of all, you have to define the problem. And so, look, I think it's fair that when people say, well, what is your strategy? Well, look, the President of the United States should not be hanging out in Cuba with a known financier of terrorism. What the President of the United States should be doing is calling together all our allies in a coalition of the willing, including those in the Middle East, that want to sit down together as leaders at a neutral location, put all the intelligence on the table so that we can find out where all the pockets of ISIS and al-Qaeda are. Because remember, we have colonies now that have spread from Western Africa all the way to Southeast Asia, and now it looks like they have a command and control structure in parts of Europe. So what the president should be doing is sitting down with these leaders, identifying the problem, and then coming up with a plan and asking all the countries to participate more than they ever have in what is really going to be a long war, a generational war against radical Islamic extremism.
Mr. Chairman, we're just about out of time, but I want to ask you quickly, so much of these operations, the alleged training camps, are supposed to be centered in Syria. We know there's been easy travel back and forth for the suspects there. Does the U.S. bear any responsibility for the continuing, ongoing, chaotic situation over the last 5 years in Syria?
Well, look, there's just never really been a plan. So when you look at what needs to be done in Iraq and Syria, that is a containment strategy. That is not a strategy ultimately to defeat ISIS, because ISIS has spread over to North Africa. So a lot of the fighters and weapons and money, et cetera, have been coming from North Africa into Syria and Iraq. So the containment strategy that's not working. We know it's not working because the threat that was identified by the intelligence community several years ago was that the worst thing that could happen is allowing people to go from the West into Iraq and Syria and then back out. So there's just a failed strategy here that's getting worse. You have the Secretary of State just on Friday saying that we're winning against Syria, against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. This seems to me to be just delusional, while at the same time you've got the President of the United States dancing down in Argentina when he should be meeting with the leaders of Europe and other allies to try to take the fight to the enemy.
Chairman Nunes, thank you so much for joining us today.